Okay, my phone died in the middle of the very end of the chapter. Now you have the proper outlook, said Bull, standing back to admire his work. Now you look like a rabbit on the run. And then here is a picture of what Malone looks like now, Edward, in his outfit. All right, chapter 14. At first, the others thought that Edward was a great good joke. A rabbit, the other hobos said, laughing. Let's chop him up and put him in the stew pot. Or when Bull sat with Edward carefully balanced on his knees, one of them would call out, Got yourself a little dolly, Bull. Edward, of course, felt a surge of anger as being referred to as a dolly, but Bull never got angry. He simply sat with Edward on his knee and said nothing. Soon the men became accustomed to Edward, and the word of his existence spread. So it was that when Bull and Lucy stepped to a campfire in another town, another state, another place entirely, the men knew Edward and were glad to see him. So it's like he's famous. Malone, they shouted in unison. Edward felt a warm rush of pleasure at being recognized, at being known. Whatever it was that had begun in Nellie's kitchen, Edward's new and strange ability to sit very still and concentrate the whole of his being on other stories of people became invaluable around the hobo campfire. Look at Malone, said a man named Jack one evening. He's listening to every dang word. Certainly, said Bull, of course he is. Later that night, Jack came and sat next to Bull and asked if he could borrow the rabbit. Bull handed Edward over. Jack sat with Edward upon his knee. He whispered in Edward's ear. Helen, Jack said, and Jack Jr. and Taffy. She's the baby. Those are my kids' names. They're all in North Carolina. You ever been to North Carolina? It's a pretty state. That's where they are. Helen, Jack Jr., Taffy. You remember their names, okay, Malone? After this, wherever Bull and Lucy and Edward went, some other hobo would take Edward aside and whisper the names of his children in Edward's ears. Betty, Ted, Nancy, William, Jimmy, Eileen, Skipper, Faith. Edward knew what it was like to say over and over the names of those that you had left behind. He knew what it was like to miss someone, and so he listened, and in his listening, his heart opened wide and then wider still. The rabbit stayed lost with Lucy and Bull for a long time. Almost 7 years passed, and in that time, Edward became an excellent hobo, happy to be on the road, restless when he was still. The sound of the wheels on the train tracks became a music that soothed him. He could have ridden the rails forever. But one night in a railroad yard in Memphis, as Bull and Lucy slept in an empty freight car and Edward kept watch, trouble arrived. So an empty freight car would be like an empty train car. A man entered the freight car and shone a flashlight in Bull's face and then kicked him awake. You bum, he said, you dirty bum. I'm sick of you guys sleeping everywhere. This ain't no motel. Bull sat up slowly. Lucy started to bark. Shut up, the man said. He delivered a swift kick to Lucy's side that made her yelp in surprise. All his life, Edward had known what he was, a rabbit made of china, a rabbit with bendable arms and legs and ears. He was bendable, though, not only if he was in the hands of another. He could not move himself, and he had never regretted this more deeply than he did that night when Lucy and Bull were discovered in the empty rail car. Edward wanted to be able to defend Lucy, but he could do nothing. He only lie there and wait. Say something, the man said to Bull. Bull put his hands up in the air. We are lost. Lost? Huh, bet you're lost. And then the man said, What's this? He shone the light on Edward. That's Malone, said Bull. What the heck, said the man. He poked at Edward with one toe of his boot. Things are out of control. Things are out of hand. Not on my watch. No, sir. Not when I'm in charge. The train suddenly lurched into motion. No, sir, the man said again. He looked down at Edward. No free rides for rabbits. He turned and flung open the door of the rail car, and then he turned back with one swift kick, and he sent Edward sailing into the darkness. The rabbit flew through the late spring air from far above. He heard Lucy's anguished howl. Oh, she cried. Edward landed on the most alarming thump, and then he tumbled and tumbled and tumbled down a long, dirty hill. When he finally stopped moving, he was on his back, staring up at the night sky. The world was silent. He did not hear Lucy. He did not hear the train. Edward looked up at the stars. He started to say the names of the constellations, but then he stopped. Bull, his heart said. Lucy? How many times, Edward wondered, would he have to leave without getting a chance to say goodbye? A lone cricket started up a song. Edward listened. Something deep inside him ached. He wished that he could cry. So before we start chapter 15, if you remember from the very beginning, Edward really had no feelings when he was with Abilene, and he was quite annoyed with people, and things have definitely changed now because he's feeling all kinds of emotions. All right, chapter 15, it looks like this. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped over Edward. She said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward, only he ain't real. She stood back up. She said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away, and he had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought. It makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to a wooden pole and spread his arms out as if they were flying, and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off, the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, the woman said. She clapped her hands. You gotta act ferocious. Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him, he thought he might actually be able to sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him, out of the garden, and toward her small house. Okay, so here is Edward. This is in the evening now. And she has tied him up, kind of like a scarecrow. And he's supposed to be scaring the crows away, and she's now calling him Clyde. That's his new name. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads of his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw-caw, caw-caw! Without ceasing, as the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. So think about this. He is so tired from being out in that hot sun all the time. Now he thinks one of these crows is actually Pellegrina, but that's not possible. Caw-caw, caw-caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You are down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him, and we are up here in our constellations together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you are all alone now? Edward could think of no one to answer that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. All right, so this is chapter 16 that we'll start next time. And now we have a boy joining our story. See you soon.